I grew up in the Dale Selby area of St. Paul, Minnesota. I went to a school, we said, that was 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Catholic, 1/3 Afro-Americans, and no white Protestants need apply. I met my wife on a picket line in St. Paul, Minnesota, at the prom ballroom on a Seder evening in 1947. And we were married that November, that Thanksgiving. We were picketing because Afro-American people were not permitted in the Palm Ballroom. 2 years later, I attended a NAACP national convention held at the Prom Ballroom. I practiced law with a major law firm from 1950 to 66. And during that period, I handled a number of cases involving the right of the mentally ill to access to the courts and some prison cases. But later, I became very active, not only in the anti-war movement, but and around the civil rights movement. But I became very active in the struggle of the Native American people. I moved out to South Dakota in '73, spent most of the year of '73 in South Dakota and returning home practicing law on weekends and returning back to South Dakota. The trial of Dennis and Banks and Russell Means began in January of '74 and occupied substantially the whole year. And we tried that case out of my office. I was the organizing attorney. It's hard to say you're the lead lawyer when Bill Kunstler's around, but the case was organized in my office, and everything that happened around our office and our preparation. I represented the people at Hormel who were during the P9 strike. I represented the members of the executive board, all of whom were indicted for criminal syndicalism, if you can believe it, and the farmers and the power line struggles, which was the major war between the agricultural community and the government over the question of resources and power. And there were lots of litigation that arose out of that. Well, I've never been a fan of Humphreys. I've always felt that that the loss of the Farmer Labor Party was a real loss. By the way, Marion LeSueur, who I mentioned a moment ago, my wife's grandmother, was the co-chairman of the DFL party at the time of the merger and opposed the merger. She was also the editor of their newspaper, the Farmer Labor Leader, and had been a member of the Elmer Benson governorship. As I grew up, the Farmer Labor Party and the Republican Party vied for office. The Democratic Party was a small third party. Hubert Humphrey's rise to power was by red baiting the Farmer Labor Party. There was significant, the Farmer Labor Party was supported significantly by the labor movement, all aspects of the labor movement, and much of the labor movement in Minnesota, as throughout the country, had been organized and led by people who were related in some fashion to the Communist Party. The red baiting that drove the drove the Farmer Labor Party into submission, also helped to destroy the labor movement. And certainly there were many major labor struggles around that period, particularly between the IUE, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and the UE, the original union, between the hotel and restaurant workers. In Rochester, there was a major confrontation involving red baiting when I was young, involving that. And so that whole struggle between the farmer labor movement and the Democratic Party was something that I felt very deeply about. And I think that it changed America and destroyed, to some extent, the progressive movement. It certainly marginalized the progressive movement. As you know, I was subpoenaed by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and because I had been chairman of the Marxist Socialist Club on the University of Minnesota campus when I was a student in the late 40s. And my position that I took was basically that I would not answer any questions about my student activity because it was too remote in time and place, and it had nothing to do with legislation. And I invited them to ask me anything since the day I started to practice law, which was January 1st, 1951. And they didn't want to ask me any questions. In any event, nothing came of my refusal to comply with their requests. And they had one hearing in Chicago after that in which a doctor basically took the same position I took, and that was the end of HUAC's hearings. They held no more. Fortunately, I was actually subpoenaed in the dying days. So what would have happened if I had been subpoenaed 2 or 3 years earlier, I don't know. But in any event, that the history is what it is. But I played maybe my little part in putting its final nail in its coffin. I think I think the destruction of the labor movement by the Humphreyites is the most significant turning event in American history. I mean, the difference between the Roosevelt era and the Today era is the difference between having a growing, massive, progressive labor movement pushing FDR in at every movement and growing in size every day, to having a morbid, self-eating labor movement in which the most important elements are fighting each other. It's just crazy. The question you asked me about the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 is a very difficult one, because I simply remember the horror and feeling of despair almost, that we just couldn't believe that this could have happened. I have no specific recollection of what I did or what my family did, other than to sit around and cry. I mean, there may have been other things that other members of our family might recall, but I can't recall much except a kind of being stunned. And there had been several other, incidents of violence, both in our community and throughout the South. And it isn't as though we were unprepared for it, but the idea that he was suddenly gone was a real shocking incident in our lives. I could not believe that the Bobby Kennedy assassination was as simple as one man in a restaurant shooting him. And it took me a long time to absorb the fact that it happened and to absorb the way it happened. I remember being a need to hear the stories again and again by the other people who had been in the kitchen. And I would listen to them and listen to them. And then I would turn to something else and listen to it again. There was a particular labor person whose name I can't remember, but who I had met on one occasion in connection with the Gene McCarthy activities, who was then had moved to Bobby Kennedy. And I remember wanting to hear him again and listening to every word they said. I don't know why, you gain anything by repeated, but that was my reaction, just to it had happened and I wanted to know more. You want to feel that you have some control of history, that your involvement has some meaning. And the assassinations are incidents that take away any meaning from anything you've done. I mean, if life and history can be so changed so dramatically by these kinds of events, it tends to shatter your commitments or your belief in the necessity of your acting. Rachel and her mother, Maridel LeSueur, lived with her mother, Marion LeSueur. They had a large home it was sort of a rooming home house. When people like Paul Robeson or other artists came to town, they could not get rooms in the hotels in downtown Minneapolis. And they stayed at Marion's home. And many of the best and most well-known national artists in the periods in the 60s and 70s. I think by the 70s it had changed in the Twin Cities, but certainly in the period of 50s, and I really don't remember when it began to change at this moment. It was clear that no Afro-American could just walk into a major hotel in downtown St. Paul and get a room. I remember in West St. Paul there was a family who had been active in the civil rights movement, who actually had participated with other people in our community, at least one other, had been on a march through the South and ended up in jail. And it was at their home. The name of the family is the Hendricks family. And it was at their home that we met Rosemary. They were the people who had invited Rosemary and two of her, other students, friends of hers from the same area to their home. There was a cross burnt on their home, on their lawn. I remember that distinctly. The racism in Minnesota was in some areas hidden and in some areas not. while it was obvious in hotels and restaurants, the communities, the places that people lived, were reasonably segregated. And while the Afro-American community was never 100% in the border lines, as I say, I grew up a block from Dale and Selby. So 2 blocks away to the south was basically to the north was basically a black community, and 2 blocks away to the south was not. But the border lines were pretty well drawn. No Afro-American community last moved west of Lexington, and as I say, south of Selby at that point. I might tell you and digress a bit to tell you that my father had a major role as a builder in this. When I was in school in the late 40s, he had a tract of land on Carroll between Oxford and Chatsworth in St. Paul, which would be on the edge of the then Afro-American community. And he desired to build an apartment house. The First National Bank wanted him to say whether it was going to be a white community building or Afro-American. He refused. He changed it into a condo. I think there were 36 units. And he hired an Afro-American realtor by the name of Archie Givens, whose son is a well-known realtor in this town now. And he said, I want to make sure that we have an Afro-American living in each of the end units and in the center, and then I don't care who you sold it to. Later, he hired that real estate agent to work for him as he built homes in an area that was moving north of University, which was also, at this point, is the Afro-American community, but at that point had none. And then he built, together with the Urban League, a whole group of homes that were sold to interracial people of either Afro-American break, and Archie Givens' father was a real estate agent on that one. And so he generally, his efforts to break down the color line in housing were relatively modest, but they were the first, and they did help some. You asked me about the things that lead up to the 1969 takeover, and to try to focus on it, you have to remember this was the Gene McCarthy campaign. And I had become very active in the Gene McCarthy campaign. I'd been active in the DFL party in our little local area and usually chaired our community caucus. And on this occasion chaired our county convention, which was a knockdown, drag-out battle between us and the Humphreyites, and we prevailed, and they rumped. And then I chaired the First District. At that point, Dakota County was a part of the First District convention. And that was a convention that was held in a hall with chairs facing each direction. Each side convened and separate. It was a very hostile and bitter thing. It had been preceded by a meeting in Austin when I was there representing the McCarthy forces, and that meeting was beginning, and when everybody fell silent and were rushed to a TV set in an off room when Lyndon Johnson announced that he was not going to run for re-election. along with a man by the name of Earl Craig, I then chaired the New Democratic Coalition, which was an effort to keep the forces of Gene McCarthy together. And the very important event in our family's history took place on the day that we had a meeting of that convention in southern Minnesota. I'm not even sure where it was, but on that day we had a major fire in our home. And we were out of our home for several months. When the incident takeover at Wounded Knee took place, Rose was living in our apartment, I think along with our youngest son. My two daughters had a apartment across the street because we couldn't find one big enough for everybody. And so at the time, we had we had to deal with the fact that our house was under reconstruction and our family dispersed. There are efforts to find Rose to arrest her after it was all over. They couldn't figure out where she was because we were at this temporary apartment that we had rented because of the fire. Well, I think the indictment was an overstatement of what took place. They sat in on the president's office for a couple of days. It wasn't even 2 full days. It wasn't hardly the end of the world. It somewhat reminds me of what's going on now with the indictment of 8 people on for having dared to oppose the Republican convention here in St. Paul. I mean, a couple of windows downtown, I think 2 windows were broken and a sack of sand dropped. That was hardly a major, major thing. And here you got 8 people who weren't involved in it, charged with a conspiracy to terrorism. I mean, it's ludicrous. In the same way, the Moral Hall charges of criminal damage to property was really quite excessive. And the jury ultimately agreed completely. I mean, the ultimate convictions were for one misdemeanor, I think, of unlawful assembly, and my memory may not be correct on it, but I think that that was the only conviction. And Rose and Horace Huntley and a man by the name of Tucker, Andy Tucker, were the only 3 people who were convicted of that. And he was charged. He was actually not convicted. He was charged because when Rose and Horace Huntley, who is now, as you know, a professor of history in the University of Alabama, walked across the bridge, Tucker was in a hurry and he walked with them at the front of the line. That's about all the only reason we could find why he was charged at all. Rose was reasonably concerned about violence upon arrest. She didn't understand that it probably a highly publicized arrest in Minnesota would not lead to the kind of violence that she know others experienced in Mississippi and throughout the South. And therefore, among other things, we wanted to arrange her surrender for arrest with relatively well-built athlete Afro-American athletes from the University of Minnesota who would accompany her to the sheriff's office because actually she didn't feel that the system itself would protect her. There is one interesting sideline event about Rose's trial that got a footnote in the church report on COINTELPRO. It seems as though, unknown to us, the FBI wrote anonymous letters to the county attorney in order to persuade the county attorney that the public was outraged by this and he should not dismiss any charges or consider any compromise. And these letters first became known to me during the period before the report was published, when the investigators for the church committee came to my office and disclosed to me these events. It's really a minor part of the church committee report, but it's interesting because it became a significant part of the church committee interfering with criminal process. And the other thing that was disclosed to me, interestingly enough, was the involvement of the FBI with the Honeywell Corporation in an effort to avoid embarrassment to the Honeywell Corporation as a result of the Honeywell project. During this period of time, I had represented the members of the Honeywell project many, many times in mass arrests at the Honeywell gates, I along with other lawyers. And so the FBI's involvement in the Morrill Hall case was, I thought, quite silly, but I mean, in a sense, but it was an indication of the nature of the mind of who was running our FBI, that they thought that it was appropriate for them to fake a public campaign of outrage against the Morrill Hall students. From the standpoint of the students, it was a major statement that they would no longer simply go to this school that was refusing to consider what was going on around the rest of the country, which was the beginning of the movement to begin to teach Black history in the major universities of the country. And that was an important beginning. And it was something they wanted, that this university had simply been dragging its feet. And so from the point of view of the students, this was a very important thing. And it was important to all of us in the community that people have an opportunity to understand our true history and not a fictitious history that is sometimes fed to us. There's nothing about the takeover that she led that amazes me, but that Rose was capable of gathering herself from that experience, completing very successfly her education, going on to teach for, 40-odd years or more in the university system and college system in Milwaukee, is really an amazing accomplishment for somebody who began with the problems that young people in the South faced, particularly in the rural and remote South. I just want to point out how remote their area was. When Rachel and I attended her actual mother's funeral, and went to the church there, we were told repeatedly that we were the first non-Afro-American people to ever be in that church. For all practical purposes, their community was the plantation with a new name.